December 10, 1941. The South China Sea, 80 miles east of Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. British Admiral Sir Tom Spencer von Phillips was about to learn a lesson that would reshape naval warfare forever. His flagship, HMS Prince of Wales, was one of the most powerful battleships on Earth. Commissioned just months earlier, she displaced 35,000 tons, carried 10 14-inch guns capable of firing shells weighing nearly a ton across 20 miles of ocean, and had armor plating up to 13 inches thick. She was, by every measure, a floating fortress. The Admiral had radioed ahead. No aircraft could sink a modern capital ship. He was about to be catastrophically, fatally wrong. 26 Japanese bombers approached his task force at wave-top level. Phillips expected his guns to fill the sky with steel. Instead, within 18 minutes, both the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, over 2,400 British and Australian sailors, would be at the bottom of the ocean, destroyed by an aircraft so revolutionary that American pilots would eventually call it a flying lighter. This is the complete story of the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, an engineering masterpiece that proved that genius and catastrophe are often separated by a single design decision. From conception through the moment it carried Japanese surrender delegates to end World War II, the Betty's journey reveals one of aviation's greatest what-ifs. What if range had been sacrificed for protection? What if the Navy had listened to the pilots instead of the engineers? What if one aircraft design could have changed the course of the entire Pacific War? The answers might surprise you.
Before the Betty could become a coffin, it first had to become impossible. 1937, the world was sliding toward catastrophe. In Tokyo, the Imperial Japanese Navy sat in a conference room facing a strategic crisis. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had shackled them. America could build capital ships at a ratio of 5-3 over Japan. In raw tonnage, the American Navy was nearly twice the size of the Japanese fleet. On paper, Japan couldn't win a conventional naval war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the same architect who would plan Pearl Harbor, stood in front of the procurement committee with a radical proposal. Forget heavy battleships and massive cruisers. Those were the thinking of the previous war. The future of naval combat belonged to aircraft. Japan couldn't match America's shipbuilding capacity, but Japan could build an aircraft unlike anything the world had ever seen. Yamamoto's requirements were staggering. A twin-engine medium bomber capable of flying 3,700 kilometers, that's 2,300 miles, more than the distance from New York to London and back again, not as a ferry flight, but as an operational combat mission with a bomb load, carrying an anti-ship torpedo or 800 kilograms of bombs, equipped with both offensive and defensive armament, fast enough to operate competitively with fighter aircraft, capable of carrying a crew of 7 for extended missions over open ocean. Engineers looked at those specifications and said something that no engineer wants to admit. It can't be done. Not with existing technology. Not with compromises that would make the aircraft impractical. Not with twin engines. A twin-engine aircraft at that range, with that payload, would require fuel capacity that would make it so heavy it couldn't get off the ground. Then, Yamamoto said something that changed everything. I want this done by 1939. 3 years. Make it happen or don't come back. Kieran Honjo led the design team at Mitsubishi. Honjo was 34 years old, educated in both Germany and America, with a reputation for innovative thinking and absolute clarity of purpose. He assembled his team and began the mathematical exercise that would define the Betty's existence. Every calculation came back to the same brutal reality. The weight budget was the enemy. To achieve the required range with the available engine power, they had to cut weight from every possible location. The question wasn't what can we include, it became what can we eliminate. One by one, protective systems were deleted from the design. Self-sealing fuel tanks, rubber compounds that automatically seal bullet holes, were eliminated. That single decision saved approximately 660 pounds. Armor plating for crew positions, another 400 to 600 pounds, deleted. Engine protection plates, gone. Fire suppression systems, deleted. Landing gear armor, removed. Escape hatch locations were optimized for weight, not crew survivability. The emergency flotation gear was minimal. One test pilot, reviewing the specifications during development, reportedly called the aircraft a flying sake barrel, a pressurized container of flammable liquid with machine guns attached. He refused to board it for the initial test flights. His concerns were noted, filed away, and ignored. Over 1,200 pounds of protective systems were removed from the design. Every single pound translated directly into fuel capacity. Every liter of additional fuel translated directly into extended range. The mathematical trade-off was absolute. Distance for defense, speed for survival, range for protection. On October 23, 1939, test pilot Katsuzo Shima took the prototype into the morning sky from Nagoya. What came back changed everything. The G4M had achieved 3,749 miles of range. It had exceeded Yamamoto's requirement by over 400 miles. The aircraft was 60% to 100% more range than any Allied bomber then flying. It was fast, 265 miles per hour in level flight. It could carry its bomb load, its crew, and fly at altitude with power to spare. Yamamoto's impossible dream had become reality. Honjo's team had done something that seemed to violate the laws of physics. They'd built the impossible. What they didn't realize, what nobody realized, was what they had sacrificed to do it. The Betty's revolutionary range came at a price that would be measured in the blood and lives of the men who flew it. When the Betty was officially adopted into service as the Type 1 attack bomber in August 1939, the Navy issued one directive to all squadrons. The aircraft's primary asset is its range. Utilize it ruthlessly. Avoid combat with enemy fighters. Strike targets beyond their reach and return home. For the first 9 months of the war, that strategy would work perfectly. It would work so well that the Navy would never question the design. It would work so well that alternatives and refinements would never be seriously considered. The problem was that strategy assumes an enemy who plays by your rules, an enemy with limited range, an enemy without fighters capable of reaching your bombers, an enemy without the will to risk their aircraft in interception missions. The Allies had none of those limitations.
For the first year of war, the Betty seemed to justify every engineering decision. It seemed perfect. It seemed unstoppable. December 8, 1941. Pearl Harbor was still smoking from the Japanese attack 24 hours earlier. Across the Pacific, American air forces in the Philippines were going through their normal morning routines, completely unaware that the war had followed them across the ocean. 53 G4M Bettys lifted off from airfields in Formosa, climbing to 15,000 feet and pointing their noses southeast toward Clark Field, the main American airbase in Luzon. The flight took 8.5 hours. During that entire journey, the American command on the ground knew nothing. No reconnaissance reports had detected them. No early warning system had picked them up. The Betty's range allowed them to conduct a bombing mission that by every metric of the time shouldn't have been possible. They arrived at dawn. The American B-17 bombers sat in neat rows on the runway, lined up like targets at a shooting range. The P-40 fighters were either still grounded or in the air on routine patrols. The base had no organized air defense. No fighters were scrambled. The Bettys descended through clouds and opened their bomb doors.
53 bombers, 53 precision-aimed attacks on stationary targets. When the smoke cleared, the United States had lost approximately 80% of its heavy bomber force in the Far East before it could even conduct a single retaliatory mission. The Betty's first action against American forces was not a failure. It was a catastrophe. American pilots who survived the attack filed reports that would be read with shock and confusion by commanders in Washington. The bombers had come from beyond their reach. They'd arrived with sufficient range to make a combat turn, drop their ordnance, and return to base. They'd operated in a strategic envelope that American doctrine said should have been impossible. Yamamoto's vision, long-range bombing against targets beyond Allied interception, had proven tactically correct. 2 days later came the most famous incident of the Betty's early career. Admiral Sir Tom Phillips, commanding British naval forces in the Far East, received intelligence that Japanese transport ships were approaching Malaya to reinforce invasion forces. He made a decision that would become a case study in naval history: steam north to intercept, with no air cover, assuming that battleship firepower would be sufficient against any air attack. The Prince of Wales and the Repulse, a battleship and a battlecruiser, totaling 65,000 tons of warship, sailed north. No aircraft carriers accompanied them. No fighter escort was available. Phillips believed battleship defenses were adequate. He was about to be proven wrong, in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft spotted the task force. Kanoa Air Group, based in Indochina, launched 26 G4M Bettys, each equipped with a Type 91 aerial torpedo. These weren't just any torpedoes. The Type 91 was considered the finest aerial torpedo in the world, reliable, accurate, and devastatingly effective. The Bettys came in low, skimming the waves to avoid radar detection. The British guns exploded at the sky, throwing up tremendous volumes of anti-aircraft fire. But the Bettys came so low, so fast, that conventional shipboard defenses couldn't track them effectively. High-angle guns designed for fast-moving aircraft targets couldn't depress enough to engage targets at wave-top height. Low-angle guns couldn't elevate fast enough to track the incoming bombers. 5 Bettys attacked the Prince of Wales. One torpedo struck her outer port propeller shaft gland. The hit flooded 2,400 tons of seawater into her machinery spaces. Her speed dropped from 25 knots to 16 knots. Crippled. The Repulse took 7 torpedo hits. Her hull buckled. Her frame twisted. The ship listed so severely that her anti-aircraft gunners could no longer effectively aim. She went down. The Prince of Wales followed shortly after, broken and dying in the water. Over 2,400 British and Australian sailors died in the ocean that day. When survivors were picked up days later, some officers were asked what had killed the mighty warships. Their answer was simple: Bettys. Throughout the military world, the message rippled with the force of a shockwave. Capital ships, considered invulnerable just months earlier, could be sunk by torpedo-carrying bombers. The Betty had rewritten the rules of naval warfare. Across the Pacific, the Betty appeared everywhere. In the Philippines, destroying American bases. In Malaya, supporting invasion forces. In the Dutch East Indies, attacking Allied shipping. In the Solomon Islands, participating in every offensive operation. The aircraft ranged across the entire Pacific theater, from the Aleutians in the north to Australia in the south, striking targets, supporting naval operations, conducting reconnaissance missions that exceeded the range of any Allied aircraft. Yamamoto had been right. Range was armor. Distance was defense. The Betty's extraordinary reach gave Japanese forces the ability to attack when and where they chose, operating from bases that, themselves, were beyond Allied striking range. The asymmetry was breathtaking. Japanese bombers could attack from distances that Allied fighters couldn't reach. Japanese bases could conduct operations that Allied aircraft couldn't effectively defend against. In the first year of combat, Japanese pilots began to understand the Betty's personality. It was easy to fly, responsive to the controls, stable in formation. The large fuselage meant crews could move around during long missions. The endurance was extraordinary. 12-hour combat missions were routine. For long-range maritime reconnaissance, long-range torpedo attacks against distant targets, and extended bombing missions across vast ocean distances, the Betty had no peer. The vulnerability was still there. It had always been there. It was just waiting for someone to look in the right places. By mid-1942, the trap had been set. The Betty's extraordinary early success had convinced Japanese naval leadership that the design was right. The aircraft had proven itself in combat. Modifications could wait, production should continue. Refinements were unnecessary. The war would be won by range, by reach, by the ability to strike targets that the enemy couldn't defend against. What nobody wanted to admit was that the Betty had only been tested against weak opposition, against surprised forces, against undefended targets, against enemies without fighter cover. The real test was coming.
August 8th, 1942. Guadalcanal. Everything changed. The Guadalcanal campaign was desperate for both sides. American Marines had established Henderson Field, the only major airbase in the southern Solomons. From that single airfield, American pilots could project fighter power across hundreds of miles of ocean and forest. Japanese forces ashore were starving, cut off, unable to receive reinforcement or supply during daylight hours because of American air superiority. Japanese naval commanders decided to reinforce and resupply Guadalcanal with a major bomber torpedo attack. 27 G4M Bettys were equipped with Type 91 aerial torpedoes and launched with escort of 15 Zero fighters. The mission was straightforward: attack the American invasion fleet anchored off the island, sink as many ships as possible, and return to base. The American fleet was ready. Radar picked up the approaching formation at extreme range. Fighter director teams vectored in all available fighters. The sky above the invasion fleet filled with American Wildcats and newly arriving Corsairs. What happened next has been analyzed by military historians for 80 years. The Bettys came in low, attempting to execute the same devastating torpedo attack they'd used against HMS Prince of Wales. But the American fighters were ready. They'd been waiting. The battle lasted less than 30 minutes. When the smoke cleared, 18 of the 27 attacking Bettys were burning wrecks in the ocean or crashing into the jungle. 2 Zeros were also destroyed. The American fleet took some damage. 3 ships were hit by torpedoes, but suffered no sinkings. 78% loss rate for the Betty formation. 3/4 destroyed in a single engagement. The pilots who survived told their command something disturbing. The Bettys didn't crash gradually. They didn't smoke and limp home for emergency landings. When hit by machine gun fire or cannon shells, they detonated. The entire aircraft became a fireball. One Betty, flown by a pilot whose name has been lost to history, took over 200 rounds of machine gun fire and still managed to limp back to base with 2 engines barely functional and the fuselage resembling Swiss cheese. That wasn't survivability. That was an exception that proved the rule. For most Bettys hit anywhere in the wing area,
The result was instantaneous catastrophe. A ball of fire, a column of smoke, an empty patch of ocean. Inside those beautiful, slender wings that gave the Betty its range were 8 unprotected fuel tanks, 4 in each wing. No self-sealing compounds, no rubber linings, no spark suppressant systems, just raw aluminum and fuel. Bettys used 962 gallons of fuel distributed across those tanks, enough to fly 3,749 miles. It was also enough to make the wings into flying firebombs. The moment a .5 caliber machine gun round or a 20mm cannon shell penetrated a tank, fuel cascaded out into the airframe. Tracers coming behind those rounds turned the fuel spray into an inferno. The physics were inexorable. Pressurized fuel spray plus hot metal plus oxygen equals fire. American pilots developed a terminology for the phenomenon. The Bettys weren't bombers anymore. They were flying lighters. The comparison was grim but accurate. A Zippo lighter contained flammable fluid in a thin metal shell with a spark-producing mechanism. The Betty contained 962 gallons of aviation fuel in thin aluminum wings with machine guns providing the spark. By late August 1942, Japanese commanders were noticing patterns emerging from combat reports. Bettys against fighter opposition suffered 75 to 88% loss rates. Against undefended targets, isolated ships, weak air defenses, unprepared positions, they could operate with near impunity. The aircraft had revealed its true nature, a specialist designed for one specific mission, long-range bombing against unprepared enemies that became a catastrophe when faced with serious air defense. The engineering trade-off that Kido Honjo had made in 1937 had come due with devastating interest. Japanese engineers understood the problem immediately. They couldn't redesign the entire aircraft, production was already committed, but they could try to retrofit protection. After 663 Bettys had been produced, Mitsubishi began experimenting with external protective measures. They applied a thick layer of self-sealing rubber on the outside of the lower wing skins. This maintained internal fuel capacity, but created aerodynamic problems. The rubber layer reduced the Betty's speed by approximately 6 miles per hour. Range decreased by almost 200 miles. The modifications barely improved survivability. The rubber couldn't stop cannon shells. Later variants, the G4M Model 3 and beyond, introduced actual internal self-sealing fuel tanks. But here's where the design curse revealed itself fully. To install self-sealing tank linings inside the existing wing structure, fuel capacity had to be reduced. The leak-blocking material took up space. Fuel capacity dropped from 962 gallons to approximately 645 gallons, a reduction of over 30%. Range fell from 3,749 miles to 2,694 miles. The aircraft that had been designed around the concept of extraordinary range now had its primary advantage cut by almost 1,000 miles. Japanese naval officers looking at those numbers faced an impossible choice: keep the vulnerable tank design, maintain the range advantage, and accept 75 to 88% loss rates, or add protection, slash the range by 40%, and lose the strategic advantage that made the Betty irreplaceable. There was no good option. The fundamental design was compromised at its core. To fix the vulnerability meant destroying the reason the aircraft had been built in the first place. The Betty had proven Kido Honjo's original theory. Distance could be armor, but it had also proven something else. Distance couldn't be armor against an enemy that was willing to meet you in your own operational envelope. Distance couldn't be armor when your aircraft turned into a fireball at the first hit.
In April 1943, the Betty would carry one final passenger, a man whose death would make the aircraft famous forever, even as it proved the aircraft was dying. Admiral Yamamoto had become the personification of Japanese military power in the Pacific. He'd planned Pearl Harbor. He'd commanded the combined fleet. He was, by any measure, the architect of Japan's initial Pacific strategy. But by April 1943, that strategy was crumbling. Guadalcanal had been lost. The Solomon Islands campaign was going poorly. Japanese pilots were being replaced by inexperienced youngsters with inadequate training. Ships were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. The aura of invincibility was evaporating. Yamamoto decided to conduct a morale tour of the forward positions. He would fly to Repulse, to the Solomon Islands, to the advanced bases where Japanese forces were fighting desperate battles. His presence, his confidence, his authority might restore morale to forces that were beginning to understand they might lose. On April 14, 1943, American cryptanalysis at Station Hypo in Honolulu broke a transmission in the Japanese naval code JN-25. The intercept contained Yamamoto's itinerary, exact dates, exact times, exact locations, to the minute. President Roosevelt read the intercept personally. He gave one word of authorization: get him. The plan was audacious. Fighter aircraft didn't have the range to intercept Yamamoto's bombers over the Solomon Islands. American bases in the Southwest Pacific couldn't generate the necessary range. But if the interceptor aircraft flew at absolute minimum altitude, wave-top height, to avoid radar detection, if they used maximum efficiency cruise settings, if they carried auxiliary fuel tanks, they might have enough range for the mission. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was selected for the intercept. 16 of them, flown by the 339th Fighter Squadron of the 347th Fighter Group, 13th Air Force. Pilots were briefed on the absolutely critical nature of the mission. They had a 9-minute window to intercept Yamamoto's flight. If they missed that window by even a few minutes, the Admiral would reach Repulse's air defenses. The intercept would be impossible. The pilots took off at dawn for a 315-mile, low-level flight. 2 hours, 30 minutes of flying time at absolute minimum altitude, at economy cruise settings, carrying enough fuel and weaponry to conduct a combat intercept against an escorted target. They navigated entirely by compass and dead reckoning. No radio navigation, no electronic assistance, just the compass, the watch, and the eyes of the flight leader. At 9:34 a.m. over Bougainville Island, the Betty appeared. Yamamoto's transport, flying slightly ahead of a second Betty and 6 escorting Zeros. The P-38 formation was perfectly positioned. The Zeros never saw them until it was too late. What happened next took less than 30 seconds. Lieutenant Rex T. Barber, a farm boy from Oregon, positioned his P-38 behind Yamamoto's Betty and opened fire. The .50 caliber rounds walked up the fuselage. The Betty's left engine exploded in smoke and flame. The nose of the aircraft dropped. The pilot couldn't recover. The aircraft was going down. Yamamoto's Betty crashed into the jungle on Bougainville Island, tumbling through trees and vegetation before coming to rest. When Japanese search parties found it the next day, they discovered Yamamoto still in his seat, upright, one hand grasping the hilt of his sword. He was dead from 2 .50 caliber bullet wounds. One had struck the back of his left shoulder, the other had entered the left side of his jaw and exited above his eye. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor, the man who had orchestrated the initial Japanese successes across the Pacific, the man who had conceived of the Betty bomber itself, he had been killed by that very aircraft, shot down in a transport mission by a single P-38 in a calculated ambush. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese officers wept openly when they learned Yamamoto was dead. The man seemed invulnerable, yet a single aircraft, betrayed by its own design, had carried him to his death. Yamamoto's death in a Betty bomber was in many ways a perfect metaphor for the aircraft's entire war.
revolutionary, vulnerable, brilliant and fatal in equal measure. An aircraft designed by genius to achieve the impossible. An aircraft that had fundamentally changed the nature of naval warfare. And an aircraft that, in the end, couldn't protect even the architect of the Pacific War from the very consequences of his strategic vision.
The Betty wasn't just a bomber. It was Japan's answer to every long-range problem the Pacific War threw at them. The Type 91 aerial torpedo, carried by Betty bombers, became the most feared anti-shipping weapon of the early Pacific War. The combination of the Betty's range, speed, and the torpedo's accuracy created a weapon system that had no Allied equivalent. American torpedo bombers, the Devastators and later the Avengers, had ranges of 800 to 1,100 miles. The Betty could fly 3,749 miles with a torpedo. The disparity meant the Japanese forces could strike at American shipping from distances where no American aircraft could respond. Throughout 1942 and 1943, Betty torpedo bombers participated in virtually every major naval engagement in the Pacific. At the Battle of Coral Sea, they attacked American carriers. At the Battle of Midway, they participated in the attacks on the American fleet. In the Solomon Islands campaign, they were the backbone of Japanese offensive operations, flying repeated torpedo attack missions against American naval forces. The loss rates were staggering. Against defended targets, against enemy fighters, the casualty rates were catastrophic. But against unprepared positions, against isolated ships, against merchant convoys with minimal air defense, the Betty's torpedo attacks were devastating. The psychological impact on American sailors was profound. A ship could be steaming peacefully when suddenly Betty bombers would appear, seemingly from nowhere, descending at wave-top level and launching torpedoes before any defense could be organized. The Betty's extraordinary range meant it could operate from bases that were themselves beyond American striking range, creating an asymmetry of power that American forces found deeply frustrating. As American air superiority expanded across the Pacific, the Japanese Navy adapted. Slow transport ships became too vulnerable to daytime air attack. Instead, the Navy began using fast destroyers to conduct high-speed night runs, carrying troops, ammunition, and supplies to forward positions and returning to base before dawn. The Allies called it the Tokyo Express. The Japanese called it rat transportation, Nezumi Yuso, because the runs took place at night and rats were creatures of darkness. The Betty bombers didn't conduct these runs themselves, but they supported them. Betty reconnaissance aircraft would scout ahead of the destroyer runs, reporting on American fleet positions. Betty fighter bombers would provide escort and cover for the high-speed destroyer movements. When American ships tried to intercept the Tokyo Express runs, Betty bombers would attack from their bases on the islands, attempting to drive off American defenses. The strategy was brilliant in conception, but ultimately unsustainable. It tied up destroyers that were desperately needed for other missions. It prevented the delivery of heavy equipment and supplies that couldn't fit on fast warships. And increasingly, American night fighter aircraft and radar-equipped destroyers were learning how to intercept and destroy these runs. But for months, the Tokyo Express was the lifeline that kept Japanese forces in the Solomon Islands supplied and fighting. Perhaps the Betty's most underappreciated role was reconnaissance, long-range photo reconnaissance missions across vast ocean distances, missions to photograph American bases in Samoa, Fiji, and Tonga, missions to monitor American carrier task force movements, missions to scout ahead of Japanese fleet operations. These missions required not bomb loads, but photography equipment, not defensive armament, but extended range and altitude performance. The Betty could fly these missions and return safely if it avoided enemy fighters. The problem was increasingly, as Allied fighter strength grew, avoiding enemy fighters became impossible. Betty reconnaissance aircraft, operated by dedicated reconnaissance units, participated in every major campaign in the Pacific. They were often the only Japanese aircraft with the range to reach distant targets and return with photographs that could be analyzed by Japanese naval intelligence.
The loss rate for reconnaissance Bettys was actually lower than for combat Bettys. Reconnaissance aircraft typically operated at altitude where enemy fighters had difficulty intercepting them. But the strategic impact of losing a reconnaissance aircraft was often greater than losing a combat-loaded aircraft. Losing reconnaissance capability meant losing the intelligence picture that naval commanders depended upon for strategic decision-making. By 1943, the Betty had become indispensable to Japanese Pacific strategy, not because it was the best aircraft for any single mission, but because it was the only aircraft capable of performing so many missions across such vast distances. The vulnerability that had been exposed at Guadalcanal made every Betty combat mission a calculated risk, but strategic necessity meant Japanese commanders had to accept those risks. The Betty had been designed as a revolutionary weapon to overcome Japan's disadvantages in shipbuilding capacity. It had become, instead, a symbol of Japanese desperation, an aircraft so specialized, so vulnerable, that losing it meant losing strategic options that nothing else could replace.
By 1944, the Betty was being pressed into service for missions that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. In late 1944, Japanese military leadership made a strategic decision born of desperation. As American forces approached the Philippines and Okinawa, conventional aircraft seemed unable to stop the advancing fleet. The Americans had overwhelming air superiority. Japanese pilots were being rotated home or killed faster than replacements could be trained. The solution came from an engineering student named Mitsuo Ota at the Aeronautical Research Institute in Tokyo. His proposal, a rocket-powered piloted bomb, a small aircraft barely more than a flying warhead equipped with 3 solid fuel rockets carrying a 2,600-pound explosive payload. A pilot would climb into this aircraft, which would then be dropped from a carrier aircraft over the ocean and guide it toward an American warship in a final kamikaze attack. The aircraft was called the Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, the cherry blossom. The Americans called it the Baka bomb. Baka means fool in Japanese. The mother aircraft selected to carry the Oka was the Betty. A demilitarized Betty, stripped of bomb doors and most armament, modified to carry the Oka externally under its fuselage. The plan was straightforward. Betty would fly to within 50 miles of an American task force, release the Oka with his pilot locked inside, and the Oka pilot would then ignite the rockets and dive at over 600 miles per hour toward an American ship. The first Oka mission was scheduled for March 21, 1945. 9 Betty bombers, each carrying an Oka rocket bomb, were launched against American forces off Okinawa. None of the Bettys reached their target area. American fighters intercepted the formation. The Betty's vulnerability, the very design flaw that had haunted it throughout the war, proved fatal once again. The combination of exposed fuel tanks, minimal defensive armament, and heavy external weight, the Oka hanging from the fuselage, made the Bettys impossibly vulnerable. 8 of the 9 Bettys were shot down before they could reach the release point. The one Betty that survived was forced to abandon its Oka and limp home. The Oka concept was eventually deployed with some success in later missions, but the Betty proved almost incapable of delivering the Oka safely through American air defenses. The aircraft that had revolutionized long-range bombing now couldn't even reliably reach a launch point just 50 miles from the target. Throughout 1944 and into 1945, Betty bombers were still flying combat missions. The aircraft had proven itself vulnerable, unreliable under sustained combat conditions, and unable to operate effectively against organized enemy defenses. Yet the Japanese Navy had no choice. There was no replacement. New aircraft were being designed, but they weren't ready. Aircraft production was being disrupted by American bombing. Pilot training programs had collapsed as trained pilots were being rotated into combat faster than new pilots could be trained to replace them. The Betty continued flying, continued fighting, continued dying. By the final months of the war, a Betty that successfully completed a combat mission and returned to base was considered lucky. Squadrons were taking 50, 60, 70% casualty rates on individual missions. The aircraft's vulnerability wasn't secret anymore. It was a grim fact that every pilot understood. The Betty was a flying coffin, but there was nothing to replace it, so pilots kept flying it, kept dying in it, kept fighting battles they knew they were losing from the moment they took off. In a final irony, the vulnerability that had haunted the Betty throughout its combat career proved almost complete by 1945. American fighters were so numerous, so effective that even the Betty's famous range couldn't provide safety. Japanese bases were being attacked by American bombers. Fuel was becoming scarce. Pilot training had degraded so much that inexperienced pilots were being put in vulnerable aircraft against experienced American pilots. The Betty, revolutionary and requelevational at the start of the war, had become a relic of an earlier era by the end of it.
When American technical officers examined a captured Betty bomber for the first time, they were shocked by what they found. In January 1945, American forces captured Clark Field in the Philippines. On that airfield sat an intact G4M Betty bomber, relatively undamaged. Major Frank T. McCoy, a technical intelligence officer, was assigned to conduct a detailed examination. McCoy's team spent 3 weeks dismantling the aircraft systematically, documenting every system, measuring every component, taking photographs, making detailed notes. Their classified report, when distributed to all Allied air forces, explained in precise technical detail everything about the Betty's design philosophy and its vulnerabilities. The report noted the extraordinary light construction. Empty weight of the aircraft was only 14,991 pounds, remarkably light for a twin-engine bomber. The fuel tank arrangement, 8 separate tanks in the wings with approximately 962 gallons capacity, no self-sealing linings, no armor protection for any crew positions, engine oil coolers mounted without protective plating, landing gear designed for simplicity rather than survivability. The report's conclusion was blunt. The Betty represented the ultimate refinement of a design philosophy that prioritized performance above all other considerations. The aircraft had been optimized ruthlessly for range and speed. Every other consideration, crew protection, survivability, defensive capability, had been sacrificed. American engineers could understand the design decisions, but they were shocked nonetheless. American military doctrine considered crew protection non-negotiable. The self-sealing fuel tank technology, despite the weight penalty, was considered essential. The idea of an aircraft with no crew armor seemed reckless, suicidal, impossible. Yet here was proof that it wasn't impossible. Japan had built thousands of these aircraft operating this way. For the historical record, consider the comparative capabilities of the Betty and the American B-25 Mitchell medium bomber. The Betty achieved a maximum range of 3,749 miles with a bomb load. The B-25 achieved a maximum range of only 1,350 miles, roughly one-third of the Betty's range. In absolute range capability, the Betty was approximately 3 times more capable. But the casualty rates told a different story. The B-25, equipped with self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating, and defensive positions to protect the crew, suffered casualty rates of 5 to 15% in combat operations. The Betty, lacking all these protections, suffered casualty rates of 75 to 88% when operating against organized enemy defenses. The B-25 was 8 times more likely to survive enemy fire than the Betty. This wasn't because of pilot quality or tactical positioning. It was because the B-25 was designed to survive, even if it meant sacrificing range. Japan had chosen to sacrifice 80% of survivability to gain 200% of range. America chose to accept reduced range to maintain crew survival. 2 design philosophies, 2 different answers to the same engineering challenge. By the end of the war, 2,446 G4M Bettys had been manufactured. The vast majority were destroyed. Shot down in combat, destroyed on the ground, scrapped by occupying Allied forces. A handful survived the war years. One particularly famous pair of Bettys carried Japanese surrender delegates to Manila on August 19, 1945. These aircraft were painted white with green crosses, international surrender markings, and escorted by American P-38 Lightning fighters, the same aircraft type that had shot down Yamamoto. The delegates rode in these Bettys to conclude the negotiations that would result in Japan's formal surrender. Symbolically, the aircraft that had inaugurated hostilities in the Pacific Theater, destroying American forces at Clark Field on December 8, 1941, now carried emissaries signaling the cessation of those hostilities. The Betty had bookended the Pacific War. Today, only one complete G4M Betty bomber survives in the world. It's preserved in the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum collection. Several incomplete airframes and fuselage sections are held by other museums and research institutions, but the vast majority of the 2,446 aircraft built are gone, destroyed by combat, scrapped, were lost to the elements. The Betty exists now only in photographs, documentation, and the memories of the men who flew in them. It remains a monument to engineering brilliance compromised by strategic desperation.
The Betty's story isn't just an aircraft history. It's a case study in the consequences of strategic miscalculation. In 1937, when Cuter Honjo and his design team made the fundamental decision to sacrifice protection for range, they were making a calculated wager. They were betting that Japan's strategic environment would remain favorable. The Japanese forces would operate from bases beyond Allied striking range, that enemy aircraft wouldn't close the tactical gap, that long-range bombing against distant targets would be sufficient to control the Pacific theater. For the first 6 months of the war, that wager paid off spectacularly. The Betty's range advantage was overwhelming. Japanese forces could strike at will, while American forces struggled to respond. But strategic environments change. American industry mobilized. American pilots got better. American technology improved. By 1942, the tactical assumptions that had driven the Betty's design were obsolete. But the aircraft had already been locked into production. Modifications meant delays. Alternative aircraft meant starting from scratch. The Japanese military, driven by the urgency of war, chose to accept the Betty's vulnerability rather than wait for something better. By the time the Betty's fundamental design flaw had been exposed at Guadalcanal in the summer of 1942, it was too late to reverse the decision. Thousands of Bettys were already in production. Squadrons were already trained on the aircraft. Strategic plans were already dependent on its capabilities. The alternative was to admit the design was fundamentally flawed and start over. No military leadership is willing to make that admission in the middle of a war they're losing. From a Japanese engineering perspective, the Betty made perfect sense. Distance was armor. The aircraft achieved an unprecedented combination of range and speed. It did exactly what it was designed to do: strike targets at ranges that were impossible for Allied aircraft to reach and return safely. The problem wasn't the engineering. The problem was the strategic context in which the engineering had to operate. The Japanese Navy had designed the Betty assuming one strategic scenario: long-range bombing against distant bases. The war that actually happened, intensive air combat in close proximity to enemy air superiority, required a completely different aircraft. This wasn't a failure of engineers. This was a failure of military leadership to accurately forecast how the war would be fought. American aircraft design pursued a different philosophy: self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating, fire suppression systems. All added weight, all reduced range, but they dramatically improved survivability. American doctrine accepted reduced range as the price for increased probability of crew survival.
This wasn't altruism. This wasn't humanitarian concern for crew welfare, though that was important. It was pragmatic recognition that skilled pilots were valuable and worth protecting. American pilots who survived combat missions could fly again, accumulate experience, develop tactics. Japanese pilots who survived combat missions were increasingly rotated out of service, replaced by less experienced pilots. The sustainability of crew survival translated directly into tactical advantage. American squadrons maintained experienced pilots. Japanese squadrons saw their experienced pilots rotated out or killed faster than replacements could be trained. Over time, this produced a widening gap in pilot quality and tactical effectiveness that no single aircraft design could overcome. The Betty story reveals a fundamental truth about aircraft design and military capability. No aircraft is simply good or simply bad. Every aircraft represents a collection of compromises. Every design decision about what to include is simultaneously a decision about what to exclude. Every strength implies a corresponding weakness. The question isn't whether the Betty was a good aircraft. The question is, was it the right aircraft for the strategic conditions it encountered? The answer historically is clear. It wasn't. The Betty was a revolutionary aircraft designed for a war that never quite happened, a long-range, unopposed bombing campaign against distant targets. Instead, it had to fight in a war of intensive air combat against growing enemy fighter strength. For that war, it was catastrophically vulnerable. The aircraft that had sunk the HMS Prince of Wales in December 1941 couldn't even reliably survive a fighter interception by 1943. The aircraft that had revolutionized long-range bombing found itself unable to complete missions against organized air defense. That's not a failure of engineering. That's the tragedy of war. When strategic assumptions prove wrong, the best-designed aircraft can become death traps. The Betty remains a testament to that hard historical truth.